Hello, welcome to WorkRise Shorts. I'm Megan Tackney, Director of Partnerships and Engagement here at WorkRise. WorkRise is a research to action network on jobs, workers, and mobility hosted by the Urban Institute. Today, we have a great conversation lined up with Kate Bahn and Mark Stelzner. Kate is the Director of Research at WorkRise, and Mark is Associate Professor of Economics at Connecticut College. We'll be diving into their research, which looks at why persistent wage disparities among identical workers of different races, ethnicities, and genders exists. Kate and Mark, welcome. It's great to have you. My first question I'm going to hand over to Kate, which is that what exact problem were you hoping to address with your research?
Sure, and thanks for having me as part of this. And so I think to start, I want to step back and sort of describe the framework that we are using, which is called monopsony. And a growing body of research has shown how the factors that shape how workers match into jobs matters a lot for what those workers are paid. And that essentially is what monopsony research looks at. It describes any time a labor market is not competitive and workers aren't matching into jobs the way we would expect they would in a competitive market. And so what we were interested in looking at this is whether we think that monopsony framework can help us understand why race and gender in particular continue to be such persistent factors that lead to different outcomes for workers by race and gender.
Thanks. So Mark, why is this a problem? Why does it matter?
So it matters for a number of reasons. First, if we put value on equality and fairness, racial and gender wage inequalities represent a key failing of the economy. Second, if we recognize this is a problem, it's important to understand the dynamics that create racial and gender wage differentials in order to respond effectively. So for example, if wage differences are due to differences in productivity, as some argue, then policy interventions to improve quality of or access to education will be central. However, if they stem from employers' ability to exercise more market power, monopsony power, as Kate said, over women and non-white workers, the most effective policy intervention would be something like universal health care, increased support for workers' collective action, and baby bonds.
And then there's another piece I want to add up on this as well, is that if we think that markets aren't competitive, sort of the way Mark has described, that also means that we can raise wages without leading to higher unemployment. And so that is a key implication for me of the monopsony framework, and why I think it's so powerful, is that if the market's not functioning well, that means there's room to improve both earnings outcomes and employment outcomes for workers.
So getting to the research, Mark, what were your specific research findings?
Yeah. So first of all, I think, our model better fits with empirics. Conventional theory dismisses empirical data that shows wage discrimination by arguing that it's either missing important variables or flawed in some other way. So our study combines key labor market aspects like firms competing for workers, frictions in the labor markets due to wealth, differences in geographic range of workers of different gender, and the potential for workers' collective actions, and the results fit much better with empirics. So for example, because our model both incorporates elements which would expose non-white and non-male workers to wage discrimination, we find a larger wage penalty for Latina and Black female workers, a larger penalty than the additive penalty from being non-white and non-male. And this is the outcome we find in the literature. In the empirical literature. Also, we find, for example, if differences exist that affect the labor supply, like relative household responsibilities or wealth inequality, and employers recognize these differences because they strongly overlap with gender and race, then the maximizing strategy for employers would be to wage discriminate, pay women and non-white workers less. So in contrast with conventional models where the market eliminates discrimination, our market highlights how employers' profit maximizing strategy would reinforce racism and misogynistic views by creating wage differences and rewarding discriminating firms. Finally, we also show that a decline in worker power through less support via the National Labor Relations Board, the courts, changes in social norms, etc., would lead to an increase in employers' ability to exercise market power over workers. And this increase in market power would be disproportionately felt by non-white and non-male workers because of their increased ability to be exploited due to gender and race-specific historical and social outcomes.
Great. Thank you. So what needs to happen, Kate? Which stakeholders are best positioned to advance this research? Is it policymakers? Is it employers? Is it workers themselves? And what do you want them to do?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a number of factors. I think, Mark touched on a little bit of that, but to go more deeply, I think we need increased support for anti-discrimination enforcement because we are fundamentally talking about wage differences by gender and race. And this can be done at the city, state, and federal level. But for me, one of the key factors would be make sure we're gathering data from employers on their pay levels by race and gender to identify if these patterns are occurring. Another piece that Mark touched on with the decline of labor, worker power, and sort of traditional protections for workers is that labor advocates are pretty important in this. So worker power is a key force in balancing the ability of employers to undercut wages. And so what that would mean is both worker advocates need to be able to organize workers, but we probably also need legislation to support the ability of worker advocates to do so. Another piece of this is that policies that help families with care responsibilities probably also help workers in the labor market. And so a key piece too that Mark had mentioned is that in order to impact people's ability to match into good jobs, we need these policies to be universal and accessible. So he had mentioned healthcare. I think that also means things like publicly supported accessible childcare, paid sick leave, paid family leave, stable, predictable scheduling practices, and improving transportation. And so those are a lot of policies that are really targeted towards families, but the other effect is that would really help workers too, if this is a big constraint on how they find jobs. And then finally, targeted wealth building policies also help. So baby bonds, which Mark had mentioned, it could also include things like helping low-income families who tend to be female-headed and non-white gain assets like owning housing. But also, I think the last thing I want to say too here is that it also reinforces the need for us to really understand what a reparations program would look like in the United States, because we know that a lot of these wealth disparities that have wide-ranging impacts, including in the labor market, are the result of centuries-old disparities resulting from slavery. And so I think we want to also look into how we can correct some of those differences through a reparations program.
Great. Thank you so much. So Kate and Mark, thank you for joining us. We're excited to see more from you on this topic. No, thank you, Mark. And you can view the full research on WorkRise's Working Knowledge blog. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.